She worked with Jenny Reddish, and work on standards and testing for poll worker documentation for the voluntary voting system guidelines. She is also an expert in plain language and usability for older adults, including groundbreaking work at AARP that was the basis for several requirements in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. She is a visiting scientist at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and a consultant for the United States Digital Service doing user research and civic design across agencies. As the editor of the Field Guide, she has taught thousands of election officials how to improve ballots, websites, and other election materials to ensure voter intent. She worked on the Anywhere Ballot, a ballot marketing interface tested for accessibility by people with cognitive disabilities and low literacy. Please join me in welcoming Dana Chisnell.
Thank you. If that is not a nerdy bio, I don't know what is. Hey, Steve, would you like your glasses? Good morning, everyone. I'm going to start with a story, except that this is not the right view of this. Please hold. You get to see behind the curtain. Sorry about this. Yep, still not. Sorry. That's what I want. There we go. Now we can start the clock. Hi again. No, this is still, darn it. All right, can I have an AV help, please? I do know how to use this technology. Okay, here's our starting story. This is Bill. Meet Bill. When I met him, he struck me as somebody who had been through a lot. But at first glance, it was pretty much impossible to tell exactly how old he was. In my head, I was guessing he was actually around 70. He walked with a limp, and his right arm swung differently from his left. But he came in a snappy brown leather blazer, and he wore a big toothy smile. He was super cheerful and really flirty. It was the fall of 2013, and we were in a library in Berkeley, California. We met Bill because he was in a study that we were doing about information about voting and elections that is published by California counties. I asked Bill what questions he had about the upcoming election. There was going to be a primary in a couple of weeks. He said he didn't know even where to start. He said, "I've never voted. I've been incarcerated, ma'am." I said, "Well, okay. Going with the flow here. You know there's an election coming up, right?" "Yes, ma'am." "Well, so let's have a look at this booklet." I gave him instructions about how I wanted him to mark it up. And then I asked him, "Do you have any questions? Are you ready to start?" He says, "Yes, ma'am. But I have a lot of trouble reading. I only just started learning, and it takes me a really long time." I said, that's fine. We've got all morning. We can spend it together going through the booklet or talking, whatever you want. But he got started. And one of the first things he encountered that he liked was the Voters' Bill of Rights. This was a revelation to him, especially the part that said he could vote even though he had been in prison. Ma'am, is this document real? Is it true that I can vote even though I've been incarcerated? He wanted to know if I'd made this up for the purposes of the test. I said, this document's real, Bill. He says, I can vote? How do I get to do that? I said, well, you just register. You can do it online today as soon as we're done. That's amazing, he says. He was totally energized now to look through the whole thing. He was empowered. We had a fantastic session. He struggled through most of the 24-page booklet, and he gave us incredibly valuable feedback. He was in line, though. It did take a long time. When Bill finished, and I'd asked all my questions, he wanted to know how to register to vote. I had a partner working with me from the League of Women Voters, and she said, come on over here. I'll help you. And she pulled up the online voter registration on the state's online voter registration website on her computer, and in 2 minutes, he was registered to vote. He practically floated out of the room. He shook hands with everybody on his way out. Bill was 56 years old. He'd spent 40 years in prison, and now he could vote. This is why I do this work, for people like Bill. And so we got him registered to vote. What happens next? Well, Bill was an inspiration for us to work with the League of Women Voters to develop a plain language version of the Bill of Rights. In 2016, that Voter Bill of Rights became law in California. Now, that's not specifically why we set out to do that research project. Our goal actually was to make information more accessible to people who are less likely to be engaged in civic life. And to do that, we had to make tools for election officials. But Bill's experience sparked an opportunity to affect change. We were in the right place at the right time with the right partners. So I came here to tell you how we mapped the American voter experience. Now, we didn't start with that as a goal. My team at the Center for Civic Design actually started out by working on some questions that ultimately led us to get to a place where we could map the voter journey. But the beginning was way before the center even started. We started with one question. Of course, finding answers to questions leads to more questions, and as you peel away the relatively easy problems, you reveal subtler issues and harder problems and deeper complexities. Each question revealed the next obvious thing to do. It took a ton of work, and some of that work was very hard. All of it was joyous. Actually, that's not quite true. Some of it was a total slog, but look, amazing things have happened because we get to do this work. Since 2012, my team has collectively heard about 500 stories about the experiences people have in the US with voting and elections. Though we had been working in this domain for a while, there was one study that really launched the beginning of our journey. It gave us our first big question. What questions do voters actually have about elections? And to follow up on that, how well do county election websites actually answer voters' questions? Here's what we learned. This is how election officials think about the process of voting in an election. You start with announcing that there's an election, get people to register, You think that people then go make some decisions about how to participate, like are they actually going to show up at the polling place or do they need to vote absentee? You find your polling place because you missed the deadline for absentee voting or you don't have a good excuse. You learn how to mark the ballot while you're there. Some people need voter ID. Leading up to the election day, you might want to find out who's actually in office now. And learn what else is on the ballot. Mark it and cast it and check the results. This is the received process, and this is basically chronological because this is how county clerks and heads of election think of elections. This is the process that they go through. But those main steps that voters take, that's the order the institution thinks of it in. And that's how they think people go through the process too. But when we talk to voters, when we ask them what questions they actually had about upcoming elections, we've been doing this now for a while, this is what we heard. What's on the ballot was the number one question. And it turns out that that question is the driver for everything that happens after that. This is actually like step 6 or 8 in the process, in the chronological process. This finding was actually a big deal. It rocked the world of election administration. When we went out talking when we went out talking about the questions that voters have and how they are and are not being answered on websites, coming out of election offices, election administrators were actually shocked. They had never thought of it this way before. But now they knew why they were experiencing some of the pain they endured in supporting voters. Why were the phones ringing? Why were people showing up at the wrong places? Turns out, this is not exclusive to websites. As we tested voter information and education on lots of different channels, we kept hearing the same kinds of things. Voters start with asking, what's on the ballot? Now, why this matters is that voting and elections in the United States is probably the hardest in the world to do. We really love our direct democracy, and if you live in California, you know this better than anybody else. Just for a basis of comparison, think back to your ballot from November 2016. I'm going to show you some examples from some other places. This is the Brexit referendum. It's a super simple, one piece of paper, large type, one question. That is all that was on this ballot. They didn't combine it with any other elections. There weren't any other questions. This is the referendum from Scotland from 2014. In case you didn't know, Scotland thinks that it wants to be an independent country, or at least some people think that Scotland wants to be an independent country. And then in June, the UK had an election, and this is the type of ballot that people across the UK use to select a party that they want to run the country, the nation, for the next several years. So much simpler than the ballots that you are usually using. Yes? Yeah. In fact, let's have a look at one of the maybe most extreme examples from the US. The whole world was aware that we were having a presidential election in November 2016. But in San Francisco, California, for example, there were also elections for US senator, congressperson, state senator, state assembly person, a judge, Board of Education, the College Board, director of the Bay Area Rapid Transit, and the Board of Supervisors. But that's not all. There were 40 questions on the ballot. And this is just a checklist. This is not the actual ballot. This is what the ballot actually looks like. This is a typical ballot for a system where you fill in a bubble and you put it into a scanner to tally the votes. This one from San Luis Obispo is pretty short. And each paper can be between 11 and 19 inches long. So you get this long card. And now you can see this can actually be a very complex problem. There are a lot of elements, a lot of stakeholders, a lot of constraints. This is a beautiful, wicked challenge that we've actually been working on with election officials for about 15 years. And when you take all of that together, voters' needs, their context, what their questions really are, how they try to answer them, what their challenges are, what they're willing to invest in their own time and energy, what their commitment is, and how they feel about it, no problem. This should be easy to fix. Like government, generally. After all, we can just run it like a business. So learning that voters are ballot-centric. And that for most people, all the decisions about whether and how to participate, that was a big deal. So how about I actually show you the map? Across the top is the received process, that gray band. That's what the institution sees. That's what inside government sees. Below that is the voter's actual path. Across all of our research, the most common question people start with is, what's on the ballot? So that's actually here. That's step 8. But then, and this is the privileged path. This is the person who has the least trouble voting that we could find. So from there, you go to step 2, where they get their ballot automatically. They get a voter guide. They have everything they need. And they have lots of options for taking part. Early voting, vote by mail, election day. But they've been in the same place for decades, so their polling place doesn't change. Finding it is not a big deal. So we're all the way here. So you already know, because you've been in your same district for a long time, and the voting system hasn't changed for a long time, how to mark the ballot, what the voting system is going to be like, and what it's like when you get to the gym cafetorium and the greeter comes up to you and says hi, because they're your neighbor. Then we get to skip a couple of steps and mark the ballot. Easy peasy, done this a million times before. And step 6, now I've voted and I can go to the county website and check the results. It's super easy. Boom, done. All online for the results. This is about as frictionless as it gets. But this is not the experience that most voters in the US have. Most voters in the US experience voting as a test, both in terms of what they have to know about what's on the ballot and to get through the gauntlet to just get a ballot in their hands. Some of the steps are very well intentioned. You want to make sure that the people are legal and eligible to vote. No question about that. And you want to give lots of options for taking part. And how hard could marking a ballot actually be? But what I'm about to show you is much closer to how many people experience voting in the US. You may recognize bits of this process in your own service design. We start in the same place, way down, step 8, because you can see that this is red. I hope that indicates that this is going to be a lot harder. He starts with what's on the ballot. Our burdened voter doesn't get a voter guide. A voter guide would be in plain language, and it would include information about everything that's on the ballot, candidates, questions, along with how to actually carry out the franchise. That would actually be helpful. He doesn't have that. Turns out that only about 9% of jurisdictions actually send out information directly to voters ahead of elections. Trustworthy information is very hard to find online. So now, he's got some decisions to make about how to take part. And deciding is actually tough because there's no information coming to him about early voting and whether he might have missed that somehow or other deadlines that have a small window. Now, our burden voter just moved to this town and he's never voted at his polling place before. It's far away from where he works. But he does manage to find it. He goes there, at least where he thinks it is, but there are not good signs. Where he lives now, he needs voter ID, which he has. Yay, that's good, but that was a big process. It was getting the ID was free, but getting to the DMV was not. And spending time waiting at the DMV was not free. Missing work was not free. Okay, note that just now at step 5, way down here in the end, we're at the place where election officials think you start out. Our voter had registered to vote, but when he moved house, he's now in a new county. He has to update his voter registration and his new address. On paper, with a wet signature, by mail. He finally gets to the polling place on election day, and he's gobsmacked by there being things on the ballot that he knew nothing about before. There are contests and candidates he knew nothing about until this moment, and he's super confused about how to actually mark the ballot because he's never seen a system like this before. This is much more what most people go through. This is behavioral economics playing out at every step. And when you add to this, especially in 2016, the kind of buzz of the information ecosystem with social media in an election, in an electoral system where presidential campaigns typically take 2 years, the whole thing can feel kind of overwhelming. So this is context. This is why it's important to answer users' questions. I'd like to compare some typical websites to some that actually offer content that thinks the way voters do. So some of these screenshots are from 2012. So if you go to these sites, you may find that they've been updated. Most of them don't make it easy to find the answer to the questions, though. Out of 28 times the question was asked in our study, participants found the answer only 17 times, about 60%. This is in Boone County, Missouri. Where would you find the answer to what's on the ballot? Is it under election information or find my information? Or maybe in this weird search box where it looks like the search fields have been redacted somehow? Like, that's actually what it looked like. This is Providence, Rhode Island. Because in New England, we run elections in towns. We're getting closer here. Maybe it's under voting information. There is at least a link to the charter amendment, so you can go look at that. But like, why is this separated from the candidates? I don't know. This is the website from the County of San Diego, Register Our Voters, from 2012. And still, try to answer the question here. Maybe it's under elections, current and upcoming, or facts for voters. Like, what could that be? It sounds sort of like bar trivia. Or, what are my electing districts? And who are my officials? Maybe it's there. Fortunately, San Diego has updated their website since then, and the architecture has improved quite a bit. Looks like you might find out what's on the ballot here, which says, view your sample ballot. So, my advice, not just from working with election departments, but working with government at all levels, is don't make people try to figure out how to navigate your department or your agency. Make sure that users feel like they're in control. But the bottom line here, all of those things actually come from understanding what people's questions really are and answering those. thing we've come to realize is that there might not even be such a thing as voter apathy. I know this is kind of a radical idea. We believe that Americans do care about voting, almost all of them. But for some, it's just harder. For some, the trade-offs at each step mean dealing with problems in the now at the expense of actually weighting what's happening in the future as a result of an election. Again, we never asked the question, are there people who don't care about voting? We asked, what obstacles do people face when they're trying to cast a ballot and casting it the way they intend? We wanted to learn, what we wanted to learn, really, was that people try really, really, really hard to vote. And in the process of learning that, we learned that they feel shame when they don't vote. So this begs the question, what obstacles are your users facing? And how do they feel when they encounter those obstacles? This is definitely true across government in my experience. Whether you're trying to vote or applying for food assistance or buying health insurance or paying your taxes or just trying to get a business license. Users make rational trade-offs, most of them unconscious, at every step. So, the big things that we learned in this study were that it takes a lot more steps to actually vote than most people realize. Mental models between the institution, the organization, and the human beings who are on the outside trying to use that service don't match up. And voters are making decisions at every step about whether to stay in or whether to drop out. Now, I'm going to do a crazy thing here because your minds are probably burning about this stuff. I want to tell you more about how we got to the journey and being able to document it. But first, I want to take your questions about how elections work. So let's take a 10-minute Q&A, and I would love to hear your questions. Who wants to go first? Somebody's in the room. We have a mic because we want everybody to hear your question.
And it's on.
I'm from Washington State, where we have
I'll vote by mail.
vote by mail by default, and yet we still have very low turnout. I mean, how much simpler can it be? You don't even have to know where your voting place is. It comes in the mail if you're registered. How can, yet we still have like less than 50% in many elections?
Local elections especially are hard. So the question was, in Washington State, where everybody gets a ballot mailed to them, who is a registered voter, turnout is still low in some elections. The phenomenon that we have been seeing is that there's a lot of media coverage and a lot in social media about national elections, about presidential elections. And if you're lucky and you're a campaign for somebody who's running at the local level and you're on the ballot at the same time, you benefit from that media wash. But if there is an off presidential cycle election or a local election, those don't get very much press. And like most people don't read their local newspaper anymore. They don't watch much in the way of television often, which is also where this stuff gets covered. And the relationship between the individual and government in terms of civic engagement is very different from what it used to be. You used to show up at public hearings because you knew that there were going to be public hearings or debates. But now it's hard to hear about them because the channels are really muffled. And there are not good ways to get that word out on social media. I was at a meeting recently where we were talking about all the bots that were used in in the presidential election, and is it possible to use bots for good in the same way? And I thought that was a really intriguing idea. But local elections are a problem practically everywhere in terms of turnout, and our theory is that it's just that it's hard to get information about them. Great question. More questions?
So I moved from Washington State to Michigan State, which does not have ballots. They send you in the mail. And I also moved to a place where I don't get voter information guides in the mail. Did you find any differences between states that do send those guides in the mail, or communities that do, and those that don't?
We don't have, yeah, that's a good question. We don't have good numbers for turnout, but we do have pretty reliable data that says where voters don't get information sent to them ahead of time that's authoritative from the local government, not from campaigns, the lines are longer because people are learning for the first time what's on the ballot when they get to the voting booth. So that's a problem. That's a trend that we've seen over and over in big elections. Yeah. There was a question up in the front.
So why don't they separate the voting based on like what the topic or the if it's a magistrate voting, is it all based on cost then?
That's complicated. Mostly it is about cost. It's very expensive to run elections. And in a couple of states, in Illinois, over the last couple of years, for example, in some townships, there's been a question of whether to pave the road or run an election. So money is tight. You see this where you work, right? And because we like direct democracy in the United States, we have elections for everything. So even though most of us think about elections every 4 years or every 2 years, there are actually elections all the time. So for example, we have been working with one state where we just observed an election a couple weeks ago, a special election, but still, this was their 5th election since November. So it's crazy, yeah. The idea of consolidating elections and having a lot of stuff all together does save costs on the administration of elections. It's not always the best thing for voters, but if you're going to hold elections all the time, maybe you need a sprint cadence and just have them every month or something. A lot of people have talked about that kind of thing. I want to address these questions quickly. These are questions that I often get. Why aren't we all using the same voting system? And they all go together. Why isn't the ballot the same everywhere? And when are we going to get a standardized voting system and ballot design? All of this starts with the 10th Amendment, which says there will be federal elections to elect the president every 4 years. Everything else is pretty much up to the states. That's not the exact wording, but that's the spirit. And so over 240 years, different election cultures have bubbled up across the country. So you have towns running elections locally in New England. You have townships and counties in other places. You have boroughs in Alaska and parishes in Louisiana. And different history and culture manifests itself. So in the Southeast, for example, the registrar of voters and the person who actually runs elections are 2 different departments because the registrar of voters is under the tax assessor's department in some states. This is from poll taxes. Voting systems, because they are not run at the federal level, because elections are not run at the federal level, there's no requirement that voting systems and ballot design be standardized across all states and all jurisdictions. And so they are not. There's sort of a de facto kind of standard emerging over time, though, as jurisdictions get better at UX and get better at design, where they've started to adopt best practices. So you'll start to see better ballots and better systems over the next 5-6 years. There's another question in the middle here.
Given the wide variety of systems and setups we have across the country and even across a single state, what would you say are the top maybe 2 or 3 key weaknesses that you see? What are the most critical things that you see that need to be fixed? What's like the top vulnerabilities for our system, the way that it's set up?
Top 2 or 3 things in election administration. Thing one that is very exciting to me is 32 states either have passed laws or have laws in their assemblies right now for automatic voter registration. So in theory, about 90% of everybody who's eligible will automatically be registered to vote unless you say that you don't want to be registered to vote. That is super cool because that removes a big hurdle for a lot of people who'd show up at the polls that don't even know that you have to register, for example. Security is gigantic. We know that there were break-ins into voter rolls in the spring and summer of 2016, leading up to the presidential election. Still, it is not known exactly how much damage was done there, if any, or if this was just a demonstration to say, we're in your house. But that's not going to be the last thing, and that's not going to be the only thing. And so the more we all understand about technology security and how that fits with usability and accessibility, the better off everybody is going to be. So I'd say those are the top things. One more question in the front. And then I will go back to telling you how it happened.
Every election period, I have my mailbox cluttered with all sorts of propaganda from various candidates, various positions. And I was wondering, do you see that people find this in any way helpful, or is this just paper noise?
So there's a thing that we have come to call the 17-second test. How long it takes you to go from your mailbox to your recycle bin with what all the materials are. So it's interesting because those are campaign materials, right, from the political parties and from the people who are running, or from campaigns for propositions and measures that are on the ballot. And those have a very recognizable look and feel to them, right? They're glossy and they're colorful and they're shiny and kind of shouty in their design. And so when we've been working with jurisdictions on voter information, one of the things that we learned was that the stuff that comes from the county or from the state should not look like that. That it's okay that's on like newsprint for a couple of reasons. One, that's recognizable as a government document. And two, that seems like a reasonable way to spend taxpayer money on that quality of publishing. So we found that to be super, super interesting. And so our third finding there was that if you make it governmenty enough so it looks authoritative but not boring, you can pass the 17-second recycle test. You can get to at least 25 seconds. And that means that somebody's going to open it up and flip through the pages. And maybe in that time, they will see that there's something useful there. Is there one more over here?
Hi, I'm from Texas, and our voting registration is a little weird because one thing I think that people have a problem with is that we have machines now. So you go in, and they give you show them your card, because, you know, we're getting sued about the whole voter registration thing. and then they give you a pen, and then you go in the machine and enter your pen and vote. So the argument I always hear is that people know exactly what I voted for, because can't they go and look at the pen and pull it out or whatever?
Right.
And so that's a big bias that I hear, because our voter registration's like, our voting in elections like 15-20%, unless it's like a bigger election.
Right.
But that pen thing in the machine, I think, has really thrown a lot of people off in Texas.
Yeah, and I could see, you can see why when you show up and you declare yourself, you check in and they give you this chit or card and you take it over to the voting system and you put it in the voting system. That actually has your ballot definition on it. It doesn't put any data on it. It works like, it doesn't work like anything else, actually. What you see on your ballot is based on your residence address, where you are registered to vote. So your ballot could conceivably be different from the guy who lives across the street from you, because you could be in different dog catcher districts or different sheriff districts or different cemetery districts. And so that little card has that ballot definition, just for you, your own personal thing. But the way voting systems are designed, even though they're crappy and they were designed and engineered in the 1990s, your ballot data, how you voted, is separated from that. That thing can't store anything except for the ballot definition. But how do you explain that to people in a polling place? That's impossible. So you can see why the mystery keeps people from coming back. Those are awesome questions. Thank you very much. So I just want to remind you where we had got to. Now let's talk about how my team got there. So my work in civic design actually started as kind of a hobby. I was just a person who wanted to do good. I was doing usability testing and UX stuff for the private sector and banks and insurance companies and tech companies. But I found my quest in 2000 after that presidential election, when people were leaving the polling place saying that they weren't sure that they had voted for the person they intended to vote for. I really wanted to understand this problem. I wanted to try to solve this problem. And so I found a team, and we just kept whittling away. This is how we did it. We started just by looking at tiny, small problems, like, would voter performance improve if things were not in all uppercase, but they were in mixed case? We tried all kinds of different methods. We took stuff from the private sector and we applied it to government-y stuff, especially voting stuff. We asked for lots of volunteers. We asked for help everywhere we went. And we worked with people in government. We didn't do this just, rogue. We connected with election officials and county clerks and said, hey, we want to go do this study. We'd love to share the results with you. Is that something you're interested in? And most of the time they said yes. But mostly we wanted to be curious. Our approach was to come in saying, we don't know anything about this space. We don't know how to do your jobs. We want to learn what's happening here. So, as I said, we didn't do this alone. My research partner and my co-director, Whitney Quisenberry, and I didn't do this work alone. It's actually taken a lot of people. So I want to thank the dozens of election officials and poll workers and voters who we've worked with and partnered with over the years. And the League of Women Voters has been amazing to work with. But you can't boil the ocean, right? We started by working on small problems, as I said. And as I described our work and our approach to a political scientist at one point, he summed up by saying, social science is great for telling you what is happening, sort of like analytics. The research that my team does helps us understand why that's happening. So I think this is an approach that we all bring in design, an approach to solving problems and understanding why the problems exist to begin with. And so I don't know any other way to do this work. understanding a big problem space without spending time with people, watching and listening to users, to human beings who are interacting with one another, mediated through technology. This is how we do it. So we spend a lot of time with users. We're always with government, not for them. We try to redefine what risk looks like. So instead of doing a big project and rolling it out all at once, feeling like at the beginning you have to know everything, we do tiny, tiny experiments to make sure that it demonstrates what we're trying to do. Prototypes and demonstrations work really great, much better than writing something up in a big specification. And always remembering that it's small changes over time that add up to big, important change. This is a marathon. It's not a sprint. So over time, we developed a large enough body of work to connect the smaller experiences to one another. We could probably not have laid out a research plan ahead of time that would lead us here. Like I said, getting to the map was not the goal. The map is just an artifact. It's not the product. We didn't do the research to make the diagram. We did the research to begin to understand the problem. So this is actually our journey. We fell in love with this problem. So on the surface, it seems really simple. The idea of making it easier to vote. But there are any number of ways to approach this. Better design, more education, more civics education, more design education for election officials. But of course, that's not that simple. For one thing, when we first asked, how do elections get done? We had no idea what the constraints were, what the resources were, what the legal issues were, what the right tools might be, what they already had for tools, what the politics are, what voters bring with them in terms of attitude and aptitude and ability. And just because we've published this map doesn't mean that we're done. I actually expect to be doing this work until I die. But when you have ballots that look like this, ensuring voter intent is not that straightforward. This is why we were interested in what questions voters have about elections and the questions that came after the first. A thing I know for sure now is that after working in UX for a few decades is that it takes a hell of a lot of data to understand big, challenging, wicked problems. Last spring, I taught a class at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government on designing government, whatever that means. And we spent 6 weeks just on methods and frameworks for understanding problem spaces. Basically, I forced them to do user research for 6 weeks. I loved it. They seemed to love it too, actually. One of the students at the end of the course, though, asked me why it took my team 2 years to develop this journey map. And I said, it actually took us 5 years to develop this journey map. He was astonished, and it occurred to me that he probably couldn't even imagine being in a job for 5 years, let alone working on the same problem for 5 years. But we needed every single data point. It took a lot of data to get to this point. 8 participants taught us a lot about how people interacted with parts of the process, but we couldn't map the experience from 8 participants. 8's not enough for that. I tell you this not to make it sound hard. I tell you this to say that we're all working on big, challenging problems. Some of those problems are disguised as smaller problems, like onboarding or account management or uptake or conversion. Modernization may be a bigger problem. Digitization, political transitions. And it's easy. It's really easy to stay there and working on those small problems. We willingly took on a wicked problem, though. We didn't expect it to solve it in a single study, or even 2. After all, if it was easy, somebody would have fixed it already. So this is what the main research agenda actually looked like. Not only did we hear 500 stories, it took a lot of people to collect those stories. Design is a team sport. The first one needed about 30 researchers and 40 participants. The next one took 100 interviews by Whitney and me on the street in usability tests. Yes, all over California. That was fun. The next one gave us more than 35 voters who had low literacy. Then we worked with hundreds of poll workers and their bosses across the country. Last year, my team tested messaging with 40-some participants and then did a diary study with 50 participants. That means that we recruited these people about 6 weeks out from the election and asked them to report back on how they were informing themselves every few days, along with some follow-up interviews. And they worked with a couple of dozen county election officials to implement some of the things that we'd all learned together. So we didn't do this alone. We couldn't possibly do it alone. We had a lot of partners and a bunch of volunteers and a few grad students, but basically a lot of help that evolved through a bunch of different methods. So the point here is to keep at it. Iterate, experiment, learn as you go, include everyone. Your immediate team, your stakeholders, business owners. You'd be surprised what business owners learn when they actually observe their own users. So you can learn more. And try all the different methods. Choosing the right method to answer the questions is really crucial, but there are lots of different ones out there. Some I think we made up. For example, we had Bill mark up a voter guide with highlighters. We told him to mark up anything that he liked and found interesting and useful in green, and anything that he found confusing and ambiguous or that somebody else might have a problem in pink. And we just used that to have a conversation after he did that. Like, is that usability testing? I'm going to say yes. There are probably some methods that we use that I'm forgetting. It all sounds like a lot, I know. But it started out small. Because it turns out that hard problems are hard. This is why I love civic design. There's plenty of work to do. So we had our first question. And you know that if you do research, finding answers to questions often leads to more questions. And as you peel away the relatively easy problems, you reveal subtler issues and harder problems and deeper complexities. Each question revealed the next obvious thing to work on. And we came away with some major findings along the way. For us, a major finding is something that changes the direction of a practice. They feel like discoveries when you find them, and then they sound obvious when you describe them to other people. So this is what happens in a major finding. It's something that reveals a source of pain for your stakeholders. It closes a gap for you and your team in how you understand the problem. And now you have a completely different frame of reference for approaching the problem from the point of view of your stakeholders. So, major insights. People want to know what's on the ballot, in case you haven't figured that out yet. How many of us have worked on websites or in apps or in software where we're designing content around how we think users need information? What we want you to know, rather than understanding questions and the experience that users come with to the site and meeting them where they are. This was a big thing. People who are new, what are the information challenges was the next study. People who are new don't know where to start asking questions. So you have to help them. It feels like an exclusive club that they're not part of. They come to a government website. They don't know how your departments are organized. Think about somebody learning about investing for the first time. That might have been you at some point, or somebody who's been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. Like, it's the same scale of problem. People want to vote or pay their taxes or pay their traffic fines. But if they can't relate to what the outcomes will be, they don't know what the consequences are, they don't know how it fits into their daily lives, then they're not going to take part. If they don't know what to do, they're not going to show up. People drop out because every obstacle is cumulative. It diminishes the investment that they're willing to make. In the US, this is really important, the government sites especially. Nearly half, 48% of all adults in the US read at or below the 6th grade level. Pair that with low digital literacy or low digital access. You can't assume that even though 91% of American adults also have cell phones, that they're smartphones, or that they use them in ways that mean they know what typical interaction design looks like. Demographics don't predict behavior. So we learned to always include people with low literacy in our studies. Designing for them makes everything better for everyone. This was a monster revelation to me, personally. And I learned it when I'd already been doing user research for about 30 years. This one, about what's the role of poll workers? This is about the flow of work for poll workers, but it's also about creating an inviting and encouraging environment for voters and setting up a secure and accountable election. This is the kind of thing that engenders trust in voters. So if there's somebody there who can actually intelligently answer the question, is my ballot on this card? That would be awesome. But now we're running into culture, right? The back-end administration experience also leaks into the front-end user experience about the service design across. This fall, we looked at what helps voters become well-informed, and what we learned was voters were frustrated in their attempts to separate the signal from the noise, the campaign materials in the mailbox, social media, dark ads, and bots that show up in your feed in various places. And in 2016, in the presidential, there was way more noise than ever before. And if users can't tell what's important and understand the messages that they're getting, they will opt out. They will stop trusting the system. And this is not just for voting, this is for all of government. When any one part of it doesn't work well from their point of view, they generalize to all of it. Information has to be useful, usable, accessible, clear, plain, and relatable. So, taken together, those insights, those highlights tell a lot of the story, I think. As I mentioned, we constantly work with election officials. We help them implement this stuff themselves in ways that they can deal with, both in terms of what their resources are like, and so they can feel comfortable that they're in control. Nothing bad's going to happen because they tried this thing. Usability and pilot testing are the best tools that I know of for mitigating risk and for showing how well or how badly a thing is going to work in the real world for real people. And all along the way, would you like me to read this list? No, I'm not going to read this list. All along the way, through all of the stories from voters, we heard just how hard it is for people to vote. There are dozens of hurdles. These are just the ones that we know about. There are others for people who are in the military or who are citizens who live abroad. There are more for people who live in underserved districts. There are more for people who have limited English proficiency. So now, this is basically our research agenda for the next 10 years. In the making of the map, we got the opportunity to look up and look across all of the work. We had helped people address hundreds of design issues that get in the way of voter intent, that helped election officials clear upstream and downstream problems for them. And we've collected a ton of data and generated findings and insights. And now we have a pretty big body of knowledge, and those small insights clustered together into ideas. And there are a few blockbuster findings out of that. The journey map just shows the differences between people and institution. But when people don't understand your content, they get paralyzed. They don't know what to do. When people don't understand what your product does or what your service is supposed to do, they also don't use it. So there may be people out in your communities who are missing out on services that you have. Because you could substitute voter in this case for customer or member or patient or veteran or taxpayer, student, parent, any number of things. And when people don't understand how their organization works, talking about all of us, they'll back themselves into corners and not participate. There's no magic shortcut here to the right answer. So let me tie this up with a little bow. The map is not the journey, but it is a really useful artifact for communicating the story to people within the team, to our partners, and to the greater public. 8 participants was not enough in any one study, but across all of these studies, we learned so much and we could pull the picture together over time. Hard problems are hard. I don't think I need to say any more about that. And every project that we do adds to how we understand this world, this problem space, and changes our mind about what the solutions are. So I urge you, go where your users are. We intercepted people on the street. We observed in polling places. We worked with election administrators to pilot things in elections. Hear their stories. Ask why. Keep asking why, and then ask again. Always be learning. Thank you. Keep up the good work. If you have any interest in elections after this, and you want to change how elections work for people, here are a few things that you can do. Except for you people in Washington State, signing up to be a poll worker, actually Washington, Oregon, Colorado, those are all vote-by-mail states now. But there's early voting in some of those places with vote centers. Being a poll worker is amazing in terms of field work and just meeting all kinds of people. It's really great. If you can't spend all day being a poll worker, I highly recommend that you get yourself registered to go observe an election in a polling place for a few hours. It is fascinating. Often the observers are from parties, but you don't have to be from a political party to do that. You can just say, I'm here from the county, I want to see how this works, or I'm here from the city. Because we know that people don't know what's on the ballot, a thing that we have seen in a bunch of places is neighbors gathered together, or neighborhood associations organize these little meetups where people take assignments to go do homework about the candidates and their positions and the measures and questions on the ballot. And then they all meet up, and everybody makes like a 2-minute presentation, a nonpartisan presentation. This is not about coercion, to help educate all the other people in the room. And this turns out to be a really energizing thing and has had good results, especially for local elections. The thing that's most important, though, is to have a plan for voting, and if you can help somebody else have a plan for getting a ballot and getting to the polling place, you will have improved things just by doing that. What I would really like is for you to find a small person, a young person, and take them with you to the polling place. A story that we've heard over and over and over again through these 500 stories is that people are more civically engaged who went with a grown-up to the polling place when they were a little kid. It's nutty, I know. It seems really simple. So find a young person and take them to the polling place next time you go. I think we can open it up to questions. Do you have questions about the map and the mapping and the research? I'm here for you. We got a mic to run again. Thanks.
Thank you. Do you have, you showed us some examples of websites from 2012 that were not user-friendly. Do you have examples of websites or other communication materials that could serve as a roadmap or as kind of a template for election officials?
Yeah, actually, there's a really great website called electiontools.org, and one of the tools on that site is an information architecture for websites. There are a few examples live out there in the world, including if you go to vote.virginia.gov, they follow this information architecture. It's an evergreen one, though you obviously have to keep the content underneath up to date, but it's a very simple one, and it does actually answer voters' questions. There are a lot of other cool tools on electiontools.org, by the way. We did this with a bunch of partners with a grant from the Knight Foundation. One of the awesome tools there is a library of icons and images for government-y stuff. That's like one of the most popular things. And there's also like a guidebook on how to use Twitter. So go there and you'll see all kinds of useful stuff. Oh, there's a usability testing kit too. Another question?
Yeah, I was wondering if, if you're at the local level and you have no budget and you're one or two or three people, doing studies like this sounds incredible, but do you have any recommendations to do it at, some sort of smaller scale that's more possible for a lot of us in the room to do?
Yeah, so to come back to election tools, all the tools there are related to elections, but there's a lot of stuff that will help in lots of other areas of local government as well. And one is the usability testing kit. And in the usability testing kit is a description of 3 different levels of usability testing. One is like walking down the hallway and getting somebody who's not in your department to look at your thing. And there's a little guide for doing that. 2 is going out into the field. And by the field, I mean if you work in the county clerk's office, go down to the first floor where people are getting birth certificates and fishing licenses and intercept them. It's really that simple. And you can do a couple of it at a time, right? You don't have to do 6 or 8. You could do a half an hour's worth today and then a half an hour's worth later in the week and pull that stuff together over time. And then there's a third level that's more formal. That has more structure, and each of those things in the kit has an overview and templates for session guides and scripts, as well as data collectors and stuff like that. And if you use it, let me know, because I want to know if it's actually usable. We've been using something like that for a long time, and so there's that. Another thing that you can do is if you are near a place that has Code for America Brigade, they definitely want to help you. And almost all those people know about user research and usability testing. You can work on a project together. This also makes an awesome school project for high school students or community college students or even university students in lots of different programs. If there's a design program, they may be keen to do this, but you could also connect to the political science department because there are a bunch of people who are going to grow up to be policy analysts who should do this stuff on the ground instead of looking at clean data sets. So I hope that gives you some ideas. Good. Cool. Other questions? You all are absolutely awesome, and I so appreciate the work you do. Please keep it up, and thank you so much for having me here.